I am Samantha Williams, 33, the invisible middle child of the Williams family dynasty. While my father groomed my older brother Jackson for succession and spoiled my younger sister Madison rotten, I was always pushed to the shadows of our family timber business. Tonight at our Thanksgiving dinner, Dad just dropped a bombshell announcement about selling the company, leaving us nothing in the process. What he doesn't know is that I've spent the last 5 years building the very company that's buying him out. If you think family dinners at your house are awkward, stick around to see their faces when they learn who runs Everest Holdings. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe and settle in for the family showdown of a lifetime. Our family story begins and ends with Williams Timber, the lumber empire my father Robert Williams built from nothing over 40 years ago. Growing up, the business was always a tangible presence in our home, like another sibling that demanded constant attention. Dad would arrive home with sawdust still clinging to his flannel shirts, his conversations inevitably circling back to quarterly projections and timber yields. From my earliest memories, the succession plan was clear. Jackson, my brother, who is 5 years older than me, was the crown prince. As the firstborn son, he was destined to inherit the family legacy, despite showing minimal interest or aptitude for the business. Dad would take 8-year-old Jackson to the lumber yards on Saturdays, placing his small hand on rough-cut pine and declaring, "One day, son, this will all be yours." I would trail behind them, invisible, absorbing every detail my brother ignored. Jackson grew into his role as the entitled heir with concerning ease. Throughout his teens and 20s, he coasted through business meetings with our father, nodding sagely at advice he would later disregard. His college years at the state university, where our father was a major donor, resulted in a barely passing business degree and a collection of fraternity connections that would later become questionable business partners. Meanwhile, Madison arrived 7 years after me, a surprise late addition to the family who quickly mastered the art of manipulation. With golden curls and a perfected pout, she could extract anything from my father with practiced ease. New car for her 16th birthday, approved without discussion. Fully funded apartment in the fashionable part of downtown after her mediocre college performance, consider it done. While Jackson was granted the business legacy, Madison was granted freedom from any responsibility whatsoever. And me? I was the functional middle child, the one who actually paid attention in business classes and graduated summa cum laude with dual degrees in finance and sustainable business practices. I was the one who read industry journals and identified market trends, while my father and brother remained stubbornly committed to outdated practices. I was the one who proposed expanding beyond traditional lumber into engineered wood products and sustainable forestry practices, only to have my carefully researched presentations dismissed with a patronizing smile from my father. "That's not how we've done things for 40 years, Sammy," Dad would say, using the childhood nickname I had repeatedly asked him to drop. "When you've built a business from the ground up like I have, then you can make those kinds of decisions." The irony was that Williams Timber would eventually need exactly the kind of modernization I proposed. The industry was changing, with competitors adopting sustainable practices and diversified product lines. But tradition and stubbornness were the twin pillars of my father's business philosophy. After college, I attempted to integrate myself into the family business, hoping my education and genuine passion would finally earn me a seat at the table. Instead, I was relegated to the Human Resources Department, a position my father deemed suitable for a woman with your temperament. The subtext was clear: human resources wasn't real business. It wasn't where decisions were made. It was a place to park me while Jackson took his place at our father's right hand. Every family gathering became a showcase for the distinct hierarchy within our family. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter all featured the same dynamic. Dad and Jackson would discuss business strategy over bourbon in the study. Madison would flutter about showing off whatever new luxury item she'd convinced our father to purchase, and my mother, Diana, would maintain a facade of domestic tranquility, pretending not to notice how I was systematically excluded. My mother wasn't cruel like my father could be, or dismissive like my siblings. She was something that sometimes hurt more complicit through her silence. A former beauty queen who had married my ambitious father in her early 20s, she had long ago surrendered any independent identity. "Your father knows best, Samantha," she would whisper when she'd find me hurt after another dismissal. "Men need to feel important. It's easier if you just accept your place." But I could never accept the place they'd assigned me. The more they dismissed my ideas, the more determined I became to prove their value. The more they treated me as an afterthought, the more I resolved to become impossible to ignore. What began as a desire for family recognition gradually transformed into something more powerful, a determination to succeed on my own terms, whether they approved or not. The Williams family dynamics were set in stone, or so they thought. What they didn't realize was that their overlooked middle child had been taking notes all along, learning from their mistakes, and formulating a plan that would eventually force them to see her clearly for the first time. My journey from overlooked daughter to secret business mogul began on my 28th birthday, the day I received the one gift that would change everything, a modest inheritance of $50,000 from my grandmother's estate. Grandma Louise had been the only family member who recognized my potential, who slipped business books into my Christmas stockings, while my siblings received flashier presents. "You've got the head for business," Shed told me once. "The rest of them just haven't figured it out yet." While $50,000 wasn't a fortune in the business world, it was enough to start something. Instead of investing in property or taking the luxury vacation my family suggested, I made a decision that would alter the trajectory of my life. I would start my own company, focusing on the future of the timber industry, not its past. Everest Holdings began in my spare bedroom with just me, my laptop, and an almost obsessive knowledge of where the forestry industry was headed. The name was significant to me twofold. First, it represented the uphill battle I faced as a woman in a male-dominated industry without my family's support. Second, it was a childhood memory, the one family vacation where I'd outperformed everyone, climbing faster and higher than even my athletic brother. Dad had been surprised then, one of the few times I'd seen genuine respect in his eyes, before Jackson demanded attention for a minor achievement. The early days were brutally difficult. I maintained my position at Williams Timber in HR, performing my duties with just enough competence not to draw negative attention. Then from 6 in the evening until often 2 in the morning, I worked on building Everest. Weekends disappeared. Social life became non-existent. Every spare moment and dollar went into researching sustainable forestry practices, identifying undervalued timberland, and developing contacts with progressive builders interested in eco-friendly materials. My first breakthrough came through Sarah Abernathy, an environmental consultant I met at an industry conference I'd attended on my own vacation time. While my father and brother networked with the same old contacts, I sought out the innovators in separate conference tracks. Sarah introduced me to a collective of small landowners in Oregon who practiced sustainable forestry but lacked the infrastructure to process and market their timber effectively. With most of my inheritance, I established a small processing facility that specialized in Forest Stewardship Council certified lumber. The margins were tight at first, but as green building gained momentum, our niche market expanded. Within 18 months, I had repaid my initial investment and was expanding into engineered wood products like cross-laminated timber, which was revolutionizing mid-rise construction. What gave Everest a competitive edge was precisely what my father and brother had rejected: adaptation to changing markets. While Williams Timber stubbornly clung to traditional lumber products and old-growth harvesting, Everest embraced carbon offset partnerships, engineered wood innovations, and direct relationships with eco-conscious architects and builders. 3 years after starting Everest, I secured a game-changing investment from Vincent Torres, a venture capitalist focused on sustainable industries. Vincent had been unimpressed during a tour of Williams Timber with my father and brother, finding their operations outdated. When we happened to sit together at an industry awards dinner my family had deemed too unimportant to attend, I shared my vision for the future of forestry. 2 weeks later, Everest Holdings had 10 million in funding and an experienced advisor who, unlike my family, actually listened to my ideas. The irony of my success was that it had to remain hidden from my family, not because I wanted it that way, but because I knew exactly how they'd react. My father would dismiss it as a lucky break, or claim I had succeeded only because of the Williams name, despite my deliberate avoidance of that connection. Jackson would feel threatened and attempt to undermine me. Madison would suddenly become my biggest supporter, but only to gain access to my growing resources. So I maintained a careful separation between my worlds. I legally changed my last name for business purposes to my grandmother's maiden name, Reynolds. I conducted most business virtually, or in locations far from our family's usual circles. I hired a trusted deputy to represent Everest at larger industry functions where I might be recognized. The few times I encountered industry contacts who knew my family, I simply explained that I was pursuing my own path and preferred my connection to Williams Timber remain private. Most respected this finding, the notion of wanting to succeed on one's own merits entirely understandable. Meanwhile, through industry networks that my family neglected, I began hearing concerning rumors about Williams Timber. Their refusal to adapt was finally catching up to them. Profitable contracts were being lost to more innovative competitors. Their outdated equipment required expensive maintenance. Environmental groups were targeting their old growth harvesting practices. Most concerning were whispers about cash flow problems and delayed payments to suppliers. Through discreet inquiries and analysis of publicly available information, I confirmed what I had suspected: Williams Timber was in serious financial trouble. My father and brother had driven the company to the brink through stubborn adherence to outdated methods and several spectacularly poor investments championed by Jackson. The company that had been in our family for generations, that had provided the comfortable lifestyle my siblings took for granted, was months away from potential bankruptcy. The revelation left me conflicted. Part of me, the part still scarred from years of dismissal and diminishment, felt a dark satisfaction. This was vindication of everything I'd warned them about. But a larger part of me couldn't bear to see my father's life's work dissolve, regardless of how he'd treated me. After weeks of careful consideration and financial modeling, I made the most consequential decision of my career. Everest Holdings would acquire Williams Timber. Not out of sentiment, but because with proper modernization and integration into my more progressive business model, the assets and client relationships of Williams Timber could be salvaged and transformed. To prevent my family from rejecting the offer outright if they knew I was behind it, I structured the acquisition through multiple layers of corporate entities and utilized intermediaries for all communications. As far as Williams Timber Management knew, they were dealing with a private equity group that specialized in forestry assets. The timing aligned perfectly with an aggressive growth strategy I had already planned for Everest. With Vincent's support and our proven track record of turning sustainable forestry into profitable business, we'd secured new investment capital and were actively looking for acquisition targets. Williams Timber, despite its current management problems, had valuable land holdings, processing infrastructure, and client relationships that could thrive under more progressive leadership. As I constructed the deal and navigated negotiations through my representatives, I wrestled with whether I would ever reveal myself as the buyer. Part of me wanted to remain anonymous, to turn the company around and sell it back to them years later at a profit, a business lesson they'd never forget. But I knew that fantasy was just that, an imagined scenario born from years of seeking validation that would ultimately provide no real satisfaction. The truth was simpler and harder. I wanted them to see me finally for who I really was. Not the overlooked middle child or the daughter relegated to HR, but a businesswoman whose vision and determination had built something meaningful. Whether they could accept that reality remained to be seen. As Thanksgiving approached and the acquisition moved into final stages, I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation. The Williams family Thanksgiving had always been a performance of family unity and business success. This year would be different in ways none of them could possibly anticipate. The drive to my parents' suburban estate on Thanksgiving morning felt like entering a time warp. The sprawling Tudor-style home with its meticulously landscaped grounds had been designed to project success and stability values my father prized above all else. As I pulled into the circular driveway in my deliberately modest sedan, I could have afforded much more, but financial discretion had become second nature in my double life. I noticed subtle signs of neglect that would have been unthinkable in previous years. The fountain in the center of the driveway remained unlit. Several ornamental shrubs had gone untrimmed. The seasonal decorations seemed fewer and less elaborate. These small details confirmed what I already knew: the family was cutting corners wherever possible while trying to maintain appearances. The Williams way had always been to preserve the facade of success at all costs. My mother answered the door before I could ring the bell, her nervous energy palpable. Diana Williams had aged visibly since I had last seen her 3 months earlier. New lines etched the corners of her eyes, and her normally perfect blonde highlights showed gray at the roots. "Samantha, darling, so wonderful you could make it," she said, embracing me with unusual intensity. "Everyone else is already here. Your father has been asking when you'd arrive." That was unlikely, I thought, but didn't say. In 33 years, Robert Williams had rarely inquired about my whereabouts or activities unless they directly impacted his schedule or image. The house smelled of roasting turkey and my mother's signature sage stuffing, but underneath lurked the unmistakable scent of tension. Voices from the living room carried a strained quality that confirmed my suspicions this was not going to be the usual Williams family performance of perfect harmony. Jackson spotted me first as I entered, raising his whiskey glass in sardonic greeting. At 38, my brother had grown to physically resemble our father, with the same broad shoulders and commanding presence, but lacking the work ethic that had built Williams' timber. Where our father wore the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions, Jackson bore the particular strain of a man discovering his presumed birthright was crumbling beneath him. "The prodigal daughter returns," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "How's life in the glamorous world of human resources, still planning team-building exercises and processing vacation requests?" This was typical Jackson, establishing dominance through diminishment. In previous years, I'd have swallowed my pride and deflected with a self-deprecating joke. Today, knowing what I knew, his condescension struck me as so tragically misplaced that I almost felt sorry for him. "Business is expanding in unexpected directions," I replied mildly. "How about you, Jackson? Any exciting developments in the traditional lumber sector?" A flash of discomfort crossed his face before he could mask it with another swallow of whiskey. "Maintaining a family legacy through challenging market conditions is exciting enough." "I'm sure it must be," I said, allowing just enough sincerity in my tone to leave him uncertain whether I was being genuine or sarcastic. Madison saved him from responding by sweeping into the room in a cloud of expensive perfume. At 28, my younger sister had perfected the art of strategic affection, calibrating her warmth based on what she hoped to extract from each family member. "Sam, you look so professional," she said, embracing me while eyeing my simple but high-quality cashmere sweater. Madison had a shoplifter's eye for price tags and could estimate the cost of an outfit within $10. "That color really works with your complexion. We never see you these days. Too busy with work." "Something like that." I acknowledged, noticing the absence of her usual array of new luxury goods. The Prada handbag slung over the chair was last season's model, and her jewelry seemed subdued compared to her usual flash. The financial strain was affecting even Madison's carefully cultivated image. My father entered last, and his appearance shocked me despite my mental preparation. Robert Williams had always been larger than life, a commanding presence who filled rooms with booming confidence. The man who stood before me retained the outward trappings of that persona: the tailored slacks, the crisp button-down shirt, the military straight posture, but something essential had diminished. He had lost weight, and his face carried the haggard look of someone not sleeping through the night. "Samantha," he acknowledged with a nod that served as both greeting and dismissal. "Glad you could make it. Your mother needs help in the kitchen." No questions about my life or work. No interest in anything beyond how I might be useful in the immediate context. Some things never changed, even as everything else was about to. In the kitchen, my mother fluttered between dishes with the nervous energy of someone using physical activity to outrun anxiety. "Can I help with anything?" I offered. "Just watch the gravy while I check the turkey," she said, then added in a lower voice, "Your father has an announcement to make at dinner. Something important about the business. I don't know all the details, but—" She trailed off, stirring the gravy with unnecessary vigor. "Is everything all right with Williams Timber?" I asked, maintaining the pretense that I wasn't intimately familiar with exactly how not all right things were. "Your father and brother have everything under control," she said automatically, then stopped herself. "Well, there have been some changes in the industry. Challenges. Your father will explain." As we worked side by side preparing the final elements of the meal, I observed how my mother's hands trembled slightly when certain topics arose. She knew more than she was admitting about their financial situation, carrying the burden of this knowledge like Shed carried so many family secrets over the decades in painful silence. Throughout the afternoon, I caught fragments of hushed conversations that confirmed the growing tensions. Jackson and my father sequestered themselves in the study for what appeared to be a heated discussion, their voices occasionally rising before they remembered the thin walls. Madison made several furtive phone calls on the back porch, her expression growing increasingly distressed with each one. When we finally gathered around the dining table with its heirloom china and sterling silver that represented generations of William's prosperity, the atmosphere was charged with unspoken anxiety. My father, seated at the head of the table, barely touched his food, his focus seemingly on the speech he was preparing to deliver. Jackson drank more heavily than usual, while Madison pushed food around her plate without eating. Only my mother maintained the charade, commenting on the tenderness of the turkey and the perfect flakiness of her pie crust, as if this were any other Thanksgiving. I ate quietly, observing it all with the strange double perspective of both insider and outsider. I belonged to this family by blood, knew all their patterns and histories intimately, and yet had been living a completely separate existence they knew nothing about. In less than an hour, those worlds would collide in ways none of them could anticipate. The tension built throughout the meal like a slowly tightening spring. When my father finally cleared his throat and set down his fork with deliberate precision, it felt like the entire room held its breath. "I have something important to discuss with all of you," he announced, his voice carrying the forced authority of someone trying to control an uncontrollable situation. "Something that affects this family and our future." The moment had arrived. I set down my wine glass and prepared for the announcement I already knew was coming, though none of them realized I had any idea. After years of being overlooked and underestimated, I was about to witness the moment when everything changed. "Williams Timber is being sold." My father stated the words, landing like physical objects on the pristine tablecloth between the turkey and cranberry sauce. "The paperwork will be finalized next week." The silence that followed was absolute. 30 years of family mythology collapsed in a single sentence. Williams Timber wasn't just a business. It was the cornerstone of our family identity, the justification for my father's authority, the promised inheritance that had shaped all our lives in different ways. Jackson recovered first, his face flushing with anger. "What are you talking about? Sold to whom? Without consulting me, I'm the vice president." My father raised a hand to silence him. "This wasn't a decision made lightly, Jackson. The company has been facing significant financial difficulties for the past 2 years. Difficulties that have accelerated in recent months." That was a diplomatic way of saying that Jackson's pet projects and mismanagement had hemorrhaged money at an alarming rate, though my father would never assign blame so directly to his golden child. "We've fallen behind on technological advances," my father continued. "Our competitors have been eating into our market share with sustainable practices and engineered products that our facilities aren't equipped to produce. Modernizing would require capital we don't have." I watched Jackson closely as he processed this. It was clear from his expression that none of this was truly news to him. He had been aware of the company's problems, but had assumed, like he assumed everything in life, that his father would somehow fix it. So, what does this mean for us? Madison interjected, getting straight to what concerned her most. For the family. My father straightened his shoulders, preparing to deliver the most difficult part. The company is being sold for significantly less than its peak valuation. After settling outstanding debts and obligations, there will be just enough to ensure your mother and I have a secure retirement. He paused, then added with uncharacteristic bluntness, there will be no inheritance. None of you will be receiving anything from the sale. I maintained a neutral expression, but inwardly I noted the irony. The father who had never seen fit to include me in the business was now including me in its failure, distributing the disappointment equally among his children for perhaps the first time. Madison's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Nothing but daddy. What about my condo payments and my startup? You promised to fund my wellness brand once you found the right moment. I'm sorry, Madison, my father said, genuine regret in his voice. He had always found it harder to disappoint his youngest. Those plans will have to be reconsidered. Jackson, meanwhile, had moved from shock to calculation. Who is buying us? What are the terms? There must be positions negotiated for existing management. I'm the obvious choice to lead during a transition period. My father hesitated. The buyer is planning significant restructuring. They'll be bringing in their own management team. So I'm out, Jackson demanded, his voice rising. 38 years as the presumed heir to Williams Timber, and I just get fired by strangers. You will receive a severance package, my father said stiffly. It's the best I could negotiate. I watched my brother struggle to process this information, his entire identity dissolving before his eyes. Despite years of resentment, I found I took no pleasure in his distress. Jackson had been shaped by the same father who had dismissed me, raised to expect a birthright he hadn't earned and wasn't prepared to manage. My mother sat silently throughout this exchange, eyes fixed on her plate. This wasn't news to her, I realized. She had known and had been carrying this burden alongside my father, putting on a brave face while their world collapsed. Then something unexpected happened. The atmosphere in the room shifted as both Jackson and Madison seemed to simultaneously reach the same conclusion. Wait, Madison said, setting down her wineglass. If you're selling the company, that means you're getting a lump sum, right? How much are they paying? My father looked uncomfortable with the direct question. The final figure isn't something I want to discuss at Thanksgiving dinner. It's relevant information, Jackson pressed, suddenly alert. Are we talking about millions? Tens of millions? After a moment of hesitation, my father answered. The offer is for $50 million. The mood transformed instantly. Where there had been shock and outrage moments before, I now saw rapidly recalculating expressions. $50 million meant that even after settling business debts, my parents would likely have a very comfortable retirement fund. And eventually, that money would become inheritance. That's a good deal in this market, Jackson said, his tone shifting from accusatory to supportive with whiplash speed. You deserve to enjoy your retirement after building the company from nothing. Absolutely, Madison chimed in, raising her glass. To Dad and his amazing business acumen getting top dollar even in a challenging market. I watched this performance with fascination. My siblings, who moments ago had been devastated by the loss of their expected inheritance, were now cheering the sale that would leave them with nothing because they were calculating the eventual windfall when our parents passed. They were playing the long game, positioning themselves as the supportive children who deserved future consideration. My father seemed surprised, but pleased by this sudden reversal, unaware of the transparent calculation behind it. My mother looked relieved, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time that day. It was time. In the momentary lull of this false celebration, I spoke up. I'm curious, Dad, who is the buyer? Which company saw the value in Williams Timber? My father turned to me with something close to genuine engagement, perhaps because I wasn't asking about my personal stake in the outcome like my siblings. A company called Everest Holdings, he said, a hint of pride entering his voice. They're relatively new but growing rapidly in the sustainable timber sector. Very forward-thinking operation. I took a slow sip of my wine, allowing the moment to stretch. And what do you know about who runs Everest Holdings? Some hotshot from the West Coast, Jackson interjected dismissively. Probably some tech guy who thinks he can revolutionize lumber without understanding the industry. My father shook his head. Actually, from what my contacts tell me, the founder has a strong background in traditional forestry, but has embraced sustainable practices and new technologies. They're extremely knowledgeable about the industry. Very impressive operation they're building. I set down my wine glass deliberately and looked my father directly in the eyes. Dad, I said calmly, I am Everest Holdings. 5 simple words that changed everything. The room fell into a silence so complete, I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. What did you say? My father finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I said I am Everest Holdings. I founded the company 5 years ago. I've been building it in parallel while working in your HR department. And now I'm the one buying Williams Timber. As my words sank in, I watched a cascade of emotions cross my father's face. Disbelief, confusion, the beginning of anger, and something else I hadn't expected, a flicker of what might have been respect, before shock reasserted itself. This is a joke, Jackson declared, looking from me to our father. She's lying. I'm not, I said simply. Check the acquisition paperwork more carefully. The holding company that controls Everest is registered under my legal name. I've been using Grandma Louise's maiden name for business purposes, but the documentation is all there. Madison stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You're worth enough to buy Dad's company? How is that possible? I built something successful by focusing on exactly what Williams Timber has been ignoring: sustainability engineered wood products and direct relationships with eco-conscious builders. The same ideas I tried to bring to Williams Timber years ago. My father had gone very still, the implications washing over him. The acquisition team, the detailed knowledge of our operations, the specific terms addressing our older timber stands. All me, I confirmed. Though I did use representatives for the direct negotiations to keep my identity private until the appropriate time. Why would you keep this secret? My mother asked, finding her voice. Why not tell us you were building your own company? The question was so genuine, so lacking in self-awareness, that I almost laughed. Would any of you have supported me? Would you have believed I could succeed? I looked around the table at their stunned faces. Or would you have dismissed it as a naive venture doomed to fail, just like you dismissed every other idea I ever brought to this family? No one answered. They didn't need to. We all knew exactly how a younger Samantha announcing entrepreneurial ambitions would have been received in this household. So this whole time in HR, you were what, spying on us? Jackson demanded, searching for a way to position himself as the victim. I was doing my job competently while building something of my own, I corrected him. I never misused company information. I never needed to. Williams Timber's problems have been obvious to anyone paying attention to market trends. And now you've manipulated the situation to take over the family business. My father said, anger beginning to replace shock. No, I replied firmly. I've made a sound business decision to acquire a company with valuable assets that complement my existing operation. The fact that it's Williams Timber is coincidental. If you'd modernized as I suggested years ago, you wouldn't be in a position where selling was necessary. The room fell silent again as my words registered. I hadn't planned to be so direct, but years of dismissal had built to this moment of absolute clarity. I wasn't the overlooked middle child anymore. I was a businesswoman who had made a rational acquisition of a struggling company. That the company belonged to my family was secondary to the business logic. What happens now? My mother finally asked, her voice small. Before I could answer, Madison surprised everyone by raising her glass. Now, she said with a brittle smile, we congratulate Samantha on her incredible success and thank her for saving the family business from outside buyers. Always the pragmatist, Madison was already recalculating her position in this new reality where I held the financial power. Jackson glared at her, not ready to concede so easily. My father remained silent, decades of certainty crumbling around him. The perfect Thanksgiving turkey grew cold on the table as the Williams family confronted a new reality, one where the daughter they'd overlooked had become the one person who could determine their futures. "This is absurd," Jackson finally declared, pushing back from the table. "There must be some kind of mistake, or manipulation." He turned to our father. "Dad, she can't possibly have built a company capable of this acquisition. She works in HR, for God's sake." My father didn't respond immediately. He was studying me with an intensity I'd never experienced before, as if truly seeing me for the first time in 33 years. The anger seemed to have receded, replaced by something more complex. "How?" he finally asked, his voice holding genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "How did you build Everest without any of us knowing?" "I started with Grandma Louise's inheritance 5 years ago," I explained. $50,000 invested in a small processing operation specializing in FSC-certified sustainable timber. I worked nights, weekends, took no salary initially. I reinvested every penny of profit. "But that still doesn't explain $50 million of valuation," Jackson interjected. "3 years in, I secured venture capital funding after proving my business model. Vincent Torres recognized the potential of what I was building." "Vincent Torres backed you?" My father couldn't hide his surprise. Vincent was a legend in industry investment circles, known for his ruthless standards and exceptional returns. "We approached his firm 2 years ago. They weren't interested in traditional lumber operations." "Because the future isn't in traditional lumber," I said simply. "It's in engineered wood products, carbon offset partnerships, and direct supply relationships with green builders. Exactly what I tried to tell you when I first joined the company." A heavy silence fell as my father absorbed this. I could almost see him mentally reviewing all those meetings where he had dismissed my suggestions, all those presentations he'd cut short with patronizing smiles. Madison, ever adaptable, had already begun reconstructing her worldview to account for my newfound position. "Samantha, this is incredible," she gushed, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I always knew you had great business sense. Remember how I used to come to you for advice about my investments?" She hadn't, of course. The only financial discussions Madison and I had ever had involved her asking for loans she never intended to repay. "What are your plans for Williams Timber?" my father asked, cutting through Madison's performance. "Complete restructuring, asset stripping. Will you even keep the name?" The question carried the weight of his life's work, his identity. Despite everything I found, I couldn't be callous about something that mattered so deeply to him. "The Williams name has value in the industry," I acknowledged. "My plan is to modernize operations, integrate sustainable practices, and leverage the existing client relationships with Everest's innovative product lines. The company needs significant restructuring, but I'm not looking to dismantle it." "And the employees?" My mother spoke up, surprising me. "The people who've worked for Robert all these years." It was perhaps the first time I'd heard her express concern about the business that extended beyond our immediate family. It reminded me that she too had relationships and connections I'd never fully considered. "Most positions will be maintained, though some will evolve as we modernize," I assured her. "My business model actually creates more jobs than it eliminates. Sustainable forestry and processing is more labor-intensive than clear cutting." My father nodded slowly, processing this information. A lifetime in the industry told him I was right, whatever his personal feelings might be. Jackson, however, wasn't prepared to accept this new reality. "And what about family?" he demanded. "What about my position? I've been vice president for 8 years. I know this business inside and out." I met my brother's gaze directly. "Jackson Williams Timber has lost market share every year you've been in leadership. The books show your pet projects have consistently underperformed while draining capital from profitable divisions." The color drained from his face. He hadn't expected me to have such detailed knowledge of his failures. "That doesn't mean," he began, but I cut him off. It means you'll need to prove your value like everyone else. I'm conducting a complete evaluation of all operations and personnel. No one's position is guaranteed based on their last name, not anymore. You can't just push us out of our own family legacy, Jackson insisted, looking to our father for support. Dad, you can't let her do this. My father rubbed his temple, suddenly looking every one of his 65 years. Jackson, the papers are already drawn up. The sale is happening. Whether we like it or not, Samantha will own Williams Timber by the end of next week. And if the deal falls through, Jackson pressed. If we refuse to sell, then the company files for bankruptcy within 6 months, my father said bluntly. We can't meet our obligations past the second quarter next year. You know this, son. We've discussed the projections. That silenced Jackson temporarily. He knew the truth as well as anyone at the table, he just hadn't been forced to acknowledge it publicly until now. My mother reached for my father's hand. Robert, perhaps we should look at this differently. Our daughter has built something remarkable. Instead of seeing this as losing Williams Timber, could we see it as keeping it in the family just differently than we expected? It was such an unexpected perspective from my typically passive mother that everyone, including me, stared at her in surprise. Diana, my father began, then stopped, considering her words. After a long moment, he turned to me with a question that felt like the first genuine inquiry he'd ever made about my professional capabilities. What would you do differently if you were running Williams Timber these past 5 years? What specific changes would you have implemented? This was my moment. The validation I'd sought for years, but now faced with it, I found no desire to be petty or vindictive. Instead, I outlined the business strategy I'd developed throughout my career: the transition to sustainable harvesting practices, investment in cross-laminated timber production, direct partnerships with eco-conscious architectural firms, carbon offset programs for our land holdings. As I spoke, I watched my father's expression transform from skeptical to considering to reluctantly impressed. He'd built his business on instinct and traditional knowledge, but he was smart enough to recognize solid business strategy when he heard it, regardless of its source. Those ideas might have saved us, he admitted finally, if we'd implemented them years ago. It's not too late, I said. Williams Timber has valuable assets and relationships. With proper restructuring and investment, it can be revitalized. Under your leadership, he stated flatly. Not a question. Yes, I acknowledged. I built Everest specifically to succeed in today's market. I know how to transition a traditional operation like Williams into something sustainable both environmentally and financially. A strange silence fell over the table as my father contemplated this new reality. Then Madison, with her unerring instinct for which way the wind was blowing, raised her wineglass again. To Samantha, she declared, the new head of the Williams business legacy. My mother hesitantly raised her glass as well. After a long moment, my father joined them, his expression unreadable. Only Jackson remained unmoved, his knuckles white around his fork, his world collapsing around him. The paperwork will be finalized next week, I said, addressing my father directly. But we don't need to wait to begin discussions about transition and integration. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow to review operations in detail if you're willing. My father studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. My office, 9 a.m., he said, falling back on the familiar formality of business arrangements. Bring your full integration plan. It wasn't acceptance, yet not fully. But it was acknowledgement, a beginning. The overlooked daughter had finally been seen, not through familial love, but through the undeniable evidence of business success. In the Williams family, perhaps that was the only language that truly mattered. As we awkwardly resumed our interrupted Thanksgiving meal, I realized we'd crossed a threshold. The family dynamics that had defined us for decades had been fundamentally altered. What would emerge from this upheaval remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: I would never be invisible to them again. The week following Thanksgiving unfolded in a series of tense meetings and revelations that transformed not only Williams Timber, but the fundamental dynamics of the Williams family. The first of these occurred precisely at 9, the morning after our holiday confrontation, when I arrived at my father's office, carrying a comprehensive integration plan for the merged companies. The Williams Timber headquarters had always intimidated me, with its wood-paneled walls, covered in fading photos of my father, with various political figures and industry leaders. The massive desk that dominated the room was crafted from a single old-growth redwood, a practice that would be unthinkable in today's more environmentally conscious timber industry. It was a space designed to project authority and tradition values my father had wielded against me whenever I proposed change. Today, however, I entered not as his overlooked daughter, but as the CEO of the company acquiring his life's work. The shift in power was palpable as he rose from behind his desk to greet me with a formal handshake rather than the dismissive nod I usually received. "Samantha," he acknowledged, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "I appreciate your punctuality." "I brought the comprehensive integration plan," I said, placing a bound presentation on his desk. "I'd like to walk through it with you to get your input on specific operations before finalizing the transition strategy." He raised an eyebrow at this, clearly having expected a more dictatorial approach. "You want my input?" "Of course," I replied matter-of-factly. "You built this company. You know its operations intimately. While I believe significant changes are necessary, it'd be foolish to discard 4 decades of industry knowledge." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle relaxation of the defensive posture he'd maintained since my revelation. He opened the presentation and began reviewing it with the focused attention he typically reserved for his most important clients. As we worked through the plan, pointing out areas of potential synergy and identifying redundancies, I observed my father transitioning from adversary to reluctant collaborator. His objections became more substantive and less emotional. He asked thoughtful questions about Everest's operations and strategy. By lunchtime, we had established a provisional framework for the company's future that incorporated elements of both our visions. The most challenging moment came when we discussed personnel, particularly Jackson's position. I had prepared detailed performance assessments of all senior management, including a particularly damning analysis of my brother's tenure as vice president. "These numbers don't lie, Dad," I said, gently indicating the consistent underperformance of divisions under Jackson's direct management. "He's not suited for executive leadership." My father stared at the data for a long moment before responding. "I've protected him," he finally admitted. "Covered his mistakes, reassigned blame when projects failed. I thought he'd grow into the role with time." "8 years is enough time to evaluate someone's capabilities," I pointed out. "Jackson has talents, but strategic leadership isn't among them." "What do you propose?" he asked, surprising me with his willingness to consider alternatives. "A position that leverages his actual strengths, client relationships, and public representation. He's personable, well-connected, and the Williams name still carries weight in traditional circles. As Director of Client Relations, he could contribute meaningfully without making strategic decisions that affect operations." My father considered this, then nodded slowly. "He'll see it as a demotion." "It is a demotion," I acknowledged. "But it's also an opportunity to succeed in a role he's actually suited for, rather than continuing to fail in one he's not." The conversation might have ended there, but my father surprised me with an unexpected question. "Why did you never tell me what you were building all these years?" The question caught me off guard. I'd prepared for resistance negotiations, even continued dismissal of my achievements. I hadn't prepared for genuine curiosity about my choices. "Would you have believed in me?" I asked quietly. "When I brought you proposals for sustainable forestry initiatives, you called them naive. When I suggested investing in engineered wood products, you said it was a passing fad. Why would you have supported me building a company based on the very ideas you repeatedly rejected?" He had no immediate answer, his gaze dropping to the family photo on his desk, a staged portrait from at least a decade earlier, all of us smiling with varying degrees of authenticity. "I misjudged you," he finally said, the admission clearly difficult for him, "and the direction of the industry. Coming from Robert Williams, this was as close to an apology as I was likely to get. I accepted it with a simple nod, and we returned to the business at hand. The meeting with Jackson later that afternoon proved far more volatile. He arrived already defensive, having heard from our father that his role would be changing in the restructured company. "So this is your revenge," he demanded without preamble. "Humiliate me by stripping away my position after all the years I've devoted to this company." "This isn't about revenge, Jackson," I replied calmly. "It's about putting people in positions where they can succeed. The data shows you've consistently underperformed in strategic leadership roles." "Data can be manipulated," he snapped. "Not these numbers," I said, sliding the same performance analysis I'd shown our father across the desk. "8 years of consistent decline in divisions under your management can't be explained away." He barely glanced at the documents. "So you're firing me. I'm offering you a position that aligns with your actual strengths," I corrected him. "Director of Client Relations. You maintain relationships well. You understand the traditional side of the business. You can be a valuable bridge between our established clients and our new direction." "A glorified salesman," he scoffed, "while you take the title that should have been mine." "The title was never automatically yours, Jackson. It needed to be earned." This fundamental truth that leadership positions should be based on merit rather than birthright seemed to genuinely shock him. All his life, he'd been told that Williams Timber would someday be his. The idea that he might need to prove himself worthy of that inheritance had never been presented to him. "And I suppose you think you've earned it," he challenged. "I built a company from $50,000 to one capable of acquiring Williams Timber," I stated simply. "Yes, I believe I've demonstrated my capabilities." He had no effective counter to this, falling instead into sullen silence. After a moment, I softened my approach. "Jackson, this isn't about punishing you. The company needs to change direction to survive, and that requires leadership with specific skills and vision. I want you to be part of that future, but in a role where you can actually succeed." Something in my tone must have reached him, because his defensive posture relaxed slightly. "And if I refuse? If I walk away entirely?" "That's your choice," I acknowledged. "But consider what you're walking away from. The Williams legacy will continue either way. The question is whether you'll be part of shaping its future." He didn't accept the offer immediately, but he didn't reject it either. As he left my office, I saw something I'd never witnessed in my brother before: uncertainty about his place in the world. For someone who'd had his path laid out from birth, this was uncharted territory. Madison proved far more adaptable. Always pragmatic about aligning herself with power, she appeared at my apartment the following evening with an expensive bottle of wine and newfound sisterly admiration. "I always knew you were the smart one," she declared as I let her in. "I told all my friends you have no idea how brilliant my sister Samantha is." I doubted this revisionist history very much, but I accepted the wine and her congratulations with good grace. "So what happens now?" she asked, making herself comfortable on my sofa. "To the family, I mean. To me." "That depends on what you want, Madison," I replied, pouring us both a glass. "Unlike Jackson, you've never been directly involved in the business." "I could be, though," she said quickly. "I have a business degree. I'm good with people." This was true, though her degree had been achieved with minimal effort, and her people skills primarily deployed in service of her social life. Still, I recognized an opportunity. "The new company will be expanding our marketing efforts, particularly in the sustainable building sector," I said thoughtfully. "We need someone who understands how to position our products within the growing eco-conscious luxury market." Madison's eyes lit up at the mention of luxury marketing. "I could do that. I know that world. I know the language, the influencers, the trends." She wasn't wrong. For all her frivolity, Madison had an intuitive understanding of luxury branding and social positioning that could be valuable if properly channeled. "It would require actual work, Madison. Regular hours, accountability for results, not a vanity position." "I can work," she insisted, surprising me with her intensity. "I've just never had to before. No one ever expected anything substantial from me." This was perhaps the most honest thing Madison had ever said to me. Like Jackson and myself, she had been shaped by our father's expectations, or lack thereof. Where Jackson had been burdened with expectation he couldn't fulfill, and I'd been dismissed despite my capabilities, Madison had been denied the opportunity to discover her potential at all. 3-month trial period I offered, as an associate marketing director, with clear performance metrics and regular evaluations. Deal, she said, immediately extending her hand to shake on it. Then, with uncharacteristic vulnerability, she added, "Thank you for giving me a chance. Dad never would have." It was the beginning of a new relationship between us, one based on mutual respect rather than the dismissive tolerance that had characterized our previous interactions. The most profound conversation, however, came from the most unexpected source. My mother requested a private lunch the following day, selecting a small cafe far from our usual family haunts. "I owe you an apology, Samantha," she said once we'd ordered her normally perfect makeup, unable to conceal her exhaustion. "I've been complicit in how you've been treated all these years." "Mom, you don't have to." "I do," she interrupted firmly. "I watched your father dismiss your ideas. I said nothing when Jackson took credit for your work. I told you to accept your place, rather than fighting for the recognition you deserved." I had never heard my mother speak so directly, or take such responsibility. The woman sitting across from me seemed fundamentally different from the carefully curated corporate wife I'd known all my life. "Why now?" I asked gently. "Because you've proven them all wrong," she said, a hint of fierce pride breaking through her composed exterior. "And because I see now what my silence has cost not just you, but all of us. The company might not be in this position if your father had listened to you years ago." "That was his choice, not yours," I pointed out. "No." She shook her head. "In a marriage, silence is a choice. I chose the path of least resistance. I convinced myself it was loyalty, but it was cowardice." The raw honesty of her self-assessment stunned me. I'd never considered that my mother might have her own regrets about how our family had operated. "What will happen to you and Dad?" I asked. "After the sale?" "We're staying together if that's what you're asking," she said with a small smile. 43 years isn't something you walk away from easily, even when things need to change." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "Your success has forced your father to reconsider many things, including how he relates to me. For the first time in decades, he's actually asking for my opinion, rather than simply informing me of his decisions." This small shift seemed to mean more to her than I could fully comprehend, suggesting depths to my parents' relationship that I'd never observed. "I hope you'll be part of our lives moving forward," she added, "in whatever way you're comfortable with. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just an opportunity to know the remarkable woman you've become." It was perhaps the most genuine conversation I'd ever had with my mother, one adult to another, without the constrained roles we'd occupied for so long. As we parted, she embraced me with unusual fierceness. "I'm so proud of you, Samantha," she whispered. "I should have said that years ago." By the time the acquisition paperwork was officially signed the following week, the Williams family had begun a transformation as significant as the one facing Williams Timber itself. Old patterns had been disrupted. New possibilities had emerged. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time it would be shaped by truth, rather than comfortable illusions. 6 months after the acquisition of Williams Timber by Everest Holdings, I stood on the observation deck overlooking the newly renovated main processing facility. The changes were both aesthetic and functional. Solar panels now covered the previously unused roof space. Waste recapture systems had been installed to turn sawdust into compressed wood products, and the break areas had been redesigned with natural light and sustainable materials to improve working conditions. But the most significant transformations had occurred in less visible ways within the complex web of relationships that made up the Williams family and business legacy. My father stood beside me at the railing, both of us watching the efficiently running operation below. At 65, Robert Williams remained an imposing figure, though he had gradually adapted to his new role as chairman emeritus rather than CEO. The transition had been difficult for him, his identity so thoroughly entwined with his position of authority that the separation caused a kind of psychological vertigo. Yet over months of working together to integrate the companies, he'd found a new equilibrium. The quarterly numbers came in yesterday, I mentioned casually. Production efficiency is up 22%, carbon footprint down 35%, and the first shipment of cross-laminated timber for the Seattle project ships next week. He nodded, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth. The Hendricks Group called yesterday. They're interested in using our products for their new healthcare complex. Hendricks? I raised an eyebrow. They've been exclusively using imported timber for years. How did we get on their radar? Jackson brought them in, my father acknowledged. Used his country club connection with the principals. Turns out when you combine our traditional relationships with your sustainable products, we offer something none of our competitors can match. The admission was significant coming from him. Acknowledgement that the synthesis of old and new created something stronger than either could achieve independently. Jackson had surprised us all by thriving in his new role as Director of Client Relations. Freed from strategic decisions that had always been his weakness, he found genuine satisfaction in the relationship building that came naturally to him. His knowledge of the traditional industry combined with growing fluency in our sustainable practices made him unexpectedly effective at bringing established clients into our new business model. Madison finalized the luxury homebuilder campaign, I added. Early metrics show engagement rates triple what we projected. My father shook his head in amazement. Never would have thought Madison had a head for business. All those years shopping high-end retail apparently taught her something about luxury marketing after all. This was another revelation of our transformed family business. Given actual responsibility and clear expectations, Madison had discovered untapped capabilities. Her intuitive understanding of aspirational marketing had positioned our sustainable products as luxury choices rather than merely ethical ones, a distinction that significantly expanded our market reach and profit margins. My mother had undergone perhaps the most subtle but profound transformation. No longer merely the corporate wife maintaining a perfect home, she had begun taking an active interest in the company's community engagement and employee welfare programs. Her suggestions about childcare support for workers and sustainability education in local schools had been implemented with surprising success. After decades of suppressing her own ideas, she was finally finding her voice. Your grandmother would be proud, my father said, suddenly breaking a comfortable silence. Louise always said you had the head for business. I should have listened to her. The statement, the closest thing to a direct apology I was likely to ever receive from him, caught me off guard. We had established a new working relationship based on mutual respect, but we rarely discussed the past directly. She gave me the start I needed, I acknowledged, both the inheritance and the confidence to use it. And I gave you every reason to prove yourself elsewhere. He added, his gaze still on the factory floor rather than meeting my eyes. I'm sorry for that, Samantha, for not seeing what was right in front of me all those years. The simple apology, delivered without qualification or excuse, represented a monumental shift in our relationship. Robert Williams had built his identity on being right, on knowing better than everyone around him. Acknowledging his fundamental misjudgment of his own daughter required a kind of courage I'd never associated with him. The company is stronger now because of both our contributions, I said, offering the olive branch he seemed to be seeking. Your foundation, my innovations. We needed both. He nodded, accepting this framing that allowed him dignity while acknowledging the value of the changes I'd implemented. We had found, if not perfect reconciliation, then a functional peace that allowed us to move forward together. Later that evening, the Williams family gathered at my parents' home for a dinner that echoed but transformed our fateful Thanksgiving 6 months earlier. The same dining table, the same china, but a fundamentally altered set of relationships around it. Jackson arrived with actual business achievements to discuss, rather than empty boasts. Madison brought mock-ups of her latest marketing campaign, eager for constructive feedback rather than automatic approval. My mother had prepared the meal herself, dismissing the caterers she'd traditionally employed for family gatherings, finding unexpected satisfaction in creating something with her own hands. As we shared the meal and discussed both business and personal developments, I reflected on the complex journey that had brought us to this point. The overlooked middle child had become the family linchpin. The dismissive father had become a respectful colleague. The entitled siblings had become productive contributors. None of us were who we'd been 6 months ago. "I have an announcement," my father said as we finished the main course. The words echoed his Thanksgiving declaration, but this time without the weight of impending disaster. "Your mother and I have been discussing our future plans, and we've decided to establish the Williams Family Foundation using a portion of the proceeds from the company sale." This was entirely unexpected. My father had always viewed philanthropy as primarily a tax strategy and public relations exercise, not a central focus. "The foundation will focus on two areas," my mother continued, unusually animated: supporting women entrepreneurs in male-dominated industries and funding sustainable business education for students from backgrounds without access to traditional business connections. I stared at them both, momentarily speechless. The initiative combined acknowledgement of the barriers I'd faced with commitment to the values that had made Everest Holdings successful. "We'd like you to serve on the foundation board, Samantha," my father added. "Your perspective would be invaluable in identifying promising candidates and initiatives." It was in its way the purest acknowledgement he'd ever offered of my business acumen and the obstacles I'd overcome in institutional commitment to supporting others facing similar challenges. The gesture represented a profound evolution in how my father understood both his privilege and his responsibility. "I'd be honored," I said simply, emotion making further elaboration difficult. As the evening continued, conversations flowing between business strategy and personal connection with an ease we'd never before achieved as a family, I reflected on the complex nature of vindication. The triumph it imagined, proving my father and siblings wrong, had been satisfying in the moment, but ultimately hollow compared to what followed: the opportunity to rebuild relationships on foundations of truth and mutual respect. The family business had been transformed, but more importantly, the family itself had been transformed. The habits of hierarchy and dismissal that had defined us for decades had given way to something more balanced and ultimately more sustainable. Like the forests we now managed with an eye toward regeneration rather than mere extraction, we had found a way to grow something new from old roots. Success wasn't measured in the momentary satisfaction of proving others wrong, but in creating systems where everyone could contribute meaningfully and be valued authentically. The lesson I'd learned through building Everest Holdings applied equally to rebuilding family relationships. Sustainable growth required acknowledging interdependence and cultivating the unique contributions each element brought to the whole. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the journey from overlooked daughter to respected business leader. The road had been longer and harder than it should have been, requiring me to build success entirely on my own before my family could recognize my value. Yet the destination perhaps held more healing than I'd imagined possible. The business cards on my desk now read, "Samantha Williams, CEO, Williams Everest Group," a joining of names that represented not capitulation to tradition, but integration of strengths. The overlooked middle child had found her voice, not by shouting to be heard, but by building something too significant to be ignored. And in that process, she'd helped her family find new voices of their own. Have you ever had to prove yourself to family members who underestimated you? What did that journey teach you about your own strength and resilience? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. And if this tale of family business drama resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with others who might need a reminder that sometimes being underestimated can become your greatest advantage. Thank you for listening to my journey from invisible daughter to CEO, and remember, success is sweetest when it lifts everyone, even those who didn't believe in you.